Hi, my name is Sam Brennan, and I'm here today to talk to you about how California production agriculture is currently at risk. I'm specifically focused on the oil bypass and beyond, and I'll be talking about how environmental policies threaten farmland, specifically agricultural production farmland. Why does California agriculture matter? Well, California is the king of U.S. agriculture. It's a top producing state contributing to over 50 billion into the economy every year with more than 400 different crops. That's two-thirds of the nation's fruit and nuts, for example, almonds, walnuts, and strawberries, as well as a third of its vegetables, lettuce, and tomatoes. Almost all of the almonds and pistachios anyone eats in the continental United States, well, those were grown in California. Why is California able to support such a wide array of agricultural commodities? Well, that's because of its Mediterranean climate and smart water systems that allow us to grow year round. But this isn't just a state issue. It's a global powerhouse. And whatever happens in this state affects a lot of countries around the world and a lot of states within our country. The California agriculture economy supports over 1.2 million jobs and sends billions in exports to over 150 countries. This leads the world in sustainable farming tech. What is the problem? The problem is California's environmental policies and government projects are eating away at our farmland and diminishing total acreage allowed for production farmland. And this is not just, as I mentioned before, it's not a California issue. It threatens food security for the state, nation, and even the world. Today, I'm going to focus on one example, the Yola bypass, to show how this is hitting farmers hard and how it's a warning for every grower in California. The issues and results learned from this one little sub example are relevant to all farmers across the state, as they're all faced with similar environmental challenges. Environmentalism versus farming. So why is this happening? This is happening because traditionally California's voters have leaned more progressive. They love environmentalism, and the government is listening. Policies and projects meant to save ecosystems or cut emissions are shrinking farmable land fast. For example, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act limits how much water farmers can pump, even from their own wells, forcing some to let fields sit empty. As I discussed in my paper, a lot of times the farmers forced to cut water are those without orchards or high-yielding crops. Now, the problem is if you're a rice farmer, you're always going to be outbid by these almond and walnut orchards that are popping up all over our state. Now, also, there's the Delta Smoke Protection, which has rules to save endangered fish that cut water from the Sacramento Delta, leaving Valley farmers high and dry. Now, once again, this leaves a lot of Central Valley farmers high and dry, mostly those of high-yielding crops such as almonds and walnuts and other orchards. Having a rice farmer or any row crop farmer go without water for a year has much, much less implications than letting an orchard farmer go without water for a year. The initial investment of orchards are much, much higher than that of row crops, and a year without water for an almond orchard could be detrimental, losing that an entire initial investment. In addition, there's also the 30 by 30 plan. Governor Newsom's push to lock up 30% of California's land for conservation by 2030. That's 6 to 8 million acres potentially pulled from production farmland. In addition, there's a high-speed rail project, which has been going on for some time. This has been sold as a green alternative to cars, but has already swallowed up to 5,000 acres of farmland in the San Joaquin Valley. These aren't optional rules, many are mandatory, backed by eminent domain or economic pressure. Farmers are losing ground, literally, to regulations they can't fight alone. It's not just one policy, it's a trend within the entire state, and soon, the country. Environmental easements are popping up everywhere, and they're here to stay. The oil bypass is just one piece of the puzzle. However, it's a big one, and it's a blueprint for what's coming statewide. Case study, the Yola bypass. Let's dive into the Yola bypass. The 59,000-acre floodplain near Sacramento was built to protect the city from floods. Many housing developments in Sacramento are actually below sea level and at risk of flooding. If the Sacramento River levee broke, a lot of these communities would be under up to 20 feet of water. So this is a huge deal that we're talking about. Now, the oil bypass, in addition to flood protection, is also ground zero for a project called the Seasonal Floodplains Fisheries Rearing Habitat. The goal of this project is to help endangered salmon by lowering the Fremont Weir, flooding the bypass more often to mimic a natural floodplain. While it's great for fish, the 42 species that thrive in the area, studies show studies show that juvenile salmon grow faster in this habitat. Specifically, the Nigiri project proves that these fish grow better on floodplains than they do just in the river alone. Much of this stems from the fact that naturally the river would flood over its banks onto the Yola bypass and surrounding areas, and the shallow water would allow for more zooplankton for the fish to eat and thus get bigger, ensuring their survival once they reach the treacherous ocean. Once we built the levees and flood protections to protect people, these fish are left with no solution and are sent to the ocean very small and unable to protect themselves from predators, and we're not seeing a great return to the spawning grounds. The Department of Water Resources is grabbing permanent flowage easements through eminent domain to make this project happen. There is a huge push to save the endangered salmon species, and is being seen as a huge key to that puzzle. What is the catch, you ask? Well, it's wiping out production farmland. Yolo County's ag economy loses up to three is going to lose up to $300 million a year because of this potential project. The flooding delays planting and sometimes kills crops entirely, tears up roads, canals, and equipment. Once the water's gone, the soil's too wet for tractors, turning prime rice fields into low-value pasture. The USGS backs the science. Fish win big. The Public Policy Institute of California calls it a multitasking marvel, how with flood control, fish habitat, and farming all in one. But neither mentions the farmers are left holding the bag and all of the implications, adaptations, and risk regarding this project. So what about compensation? Well, compensation currently is a one-time payment for the easement with no help for ongoing losses. And this isn't the end. The project could stretch upstream all the way to Red Bluff and inspire other projects in other watersheds. This is simply a test case for how California balances green goals with ag. And right now, farmers are losing. And that last thing I talked about kind of goes a little bit along the farmer's burden. The crop delays, infrastructure damage, sorry, one-time easement pays, no loss for coverage. Basically, the increased flowage easement is only a one-time buyout, but it is not a buyout of the land. The farmers will be left holding the land and only receive compensation for this easement. That's why it's imperative that they know how to negotiate properly and understand the implications of the easement and other environmental regulations surrounding this project in their area, specifically the Yola bypass. So, how are they fighting back? Farmers are fighting back by getting their own, how do I say this? Getting their own legal representation and real estate representation, including appraisals and third-party help. Take Nags Ranch and the bypass, for example. They got a third-party appraisal valuing their 2,143 acres at 12.8 million after the easement. What this really means, though, is that the easement should be valued at 12.8 million. The 12.8 million is not the value after the easement. It is simply the difference in value before when their land was able for production agriculture and after when it's now going to have the highest and best use of pasture. That difference is $12.8 million. It will be grazing land because the flooding is too unpredictable. You can't make money farming when it's too wet to plant your crops. This is why they are pushing for full buyouts, arguing that the easement makes their land worthless. They're not wrong because the flooding used to stop at March 15th. Historically, farming in the bypass has always been a little bit of a jeopardy, which is why the land has been valued a little bit less. However, there's always been a strict cutoff of March 15th for all flooding dates. This new easement does not have a strict cutoff date, which makes the uncertainty too great to continue production agriculture within the bypass. Legal battles are going to be the new normal. Farmers spend more time with lawyers and tractors. Local pushback did not force a compromise. A March 15th cutoff date reduced flows after March 1st was kind of figured out, but it was not implemented fully. The state's eminent domain power means that no mandatory payment for lost harvests. If that doesn't cover a farmer's mortgage, they're sunk. This isn't just about fish, it's about who controls the land. Farmers need cash, legal muscle, and unity to survive this shift. Basically, what's going on is these farmers underneath this new proposed easement will receive a one-time payout. However, this payout does not guarantee any future uh, benefit, consult, or help for farmers further down the line, even associated with the risk that they have pays with this proposed easement. So, what's at stake? What's at stake is millions of acres statewide because this project is a blueprint for further projects, and other projects I've mentioned are already implemented. There's a lot of food security on the line, as well as implications for the economy as a whole. If the governor's 30 by 30, which is 30% of the land conserved by 2030, that could take out 6.8 or 6 to 8 million acres out of production. This would be a huge hit for California agriculture and for the United States as a whole. What is the path forward? Well, the YOLO bypass shows how environmental projects put fish and cities first, leaving farmers to adapt or disappear. It's not just 59,000 acres. Millions of more acres are at risk from, from similar moves, projects, and environmental regulations. What needs to happen is a compromise between environmentalism and farming. Subsidies or habitat leasing could offset losses, and easements right now could potentially gut livelihoods. Farmers have to band together, pool money for appraisals, and lawyers to fight back. They need to stay sharp, track every project, every regulation, so that they're ready to negotiate when their time comes. This isn't the 1930s when weather was the big worry. Today, it's the state knocking at your door. While innovation is great, it won't save the farmers once the land's gone. The oil bypass isn't unique. It's a warning. If we don't act, California's ag legacy could fade, and with it, a huge chunk of our food supply. So let's fight for a balance that keeps our farmers in the game. Basically, this project is a huge, I don't want to say warning sign, but it's a huge example of what's to come in the state and what's already come. I mean, we live in California, and farmers in California have already dealt with a multitude of issues relating to environmental regulations and state projects. What this example shows is that farmers need to be paying attention to the news, paying attention to local council meetings, going to all their Farm Bureau meetings, and finding out what is actually in the works in their area. A lot of times these projects take years and years. This salmon project we were talking about, it's been 15 years in the making. So if you are attentive and you see when this first comes online, you can start implementing your own kind of conservation practices into your farm to try and like heed anything coming forward in these projects. It's imperative that farmers stay informed about these projects and stay informed about current projects undergoing. What did these farmers do? What solutions did they get? What did they reach in their negotiations? Did they reach an adequate compromise? Were they able to stay in business? Were they able to, et cetera, et cetera? That's going to be really, really important moving forward is attentiveness, um, and and everything, and just pulling together, talking to other farmers and figuring out how can we compromise between and the pressing environmental concerns, which, this isn't to say that they're not actually concerns. They are concerns, and we do need to implement environmental practices. But how can those coexist or at least help farmers get out of the land that we need for conservation? I appreciate you watching my